All right, folks, let's start. On behalf of all of us here at Phillips and Company, we'd like to thank all of you for joining us today on our third Zoom speaker series. We hope you and your loved ones are safe and healthy in this unprecedented time. We have an interesting speaker and some interactive surveys for you today. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A button, and we'll have time at the end to have our speaker answer those. Before we start and before I introduce Morgan, I was asked, hey, why do we have a writer and a storyteller as a speaker? Why not an economist or a market forecaster? It was a great question. And again, before I introduce Morgan, I'm going to tell a little story of my own. The story dates back to 1961, and Sandy Koufax, who was one of the greatest lefty pitchers in baseball history. Now, most know who Koufax is, but very few really know the name Norm Sherry. Norm was this bullpen catcher from the Dodgers, and one day told Koufax, who had kind of this career control problem, he was a sloppy pitcher, hey, take a little heat off your pitch, throw the ball so I can catch it. That led to one of the greatest turnarounds in a Hall of Fame career for Koufax. And you can see his ERAs, if you're a baseball aficionado, were pretty terrible until he ran into Norm Sherry. And in many regards, kind of we're in the same business. We're in the business of throwing pitches so you, our clients, can catch them. We often explain abstract concepts that are counterintuitive, like compounding interest, discounting, the future, and risk. And for us, telling great stories makes those elusive concepts come to life. It makes us more effective, and it makes you more successful. And so let me connect all of that to Morgan. Morgan is an award-winning financial storyteller in the highest compliment that helps us deliver a pitch that can be caught by you. In my opinion, he's the best financial writer since Michael Lewis. He's published a new book, The Psychology of Money. Not only is it great for seasoned pros that, like me, that spent 30 years in this business, but I've even had my young kids who are in their early 20s read his book because it makes so much sense. So Morgan, welcome, and we look forward to having you tell us some stories that help us understand some of these elusive concepts.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. It's always good to do these in person, but in this year, I'm glad that we can still do something like this online and virtually. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen today. I have some slides for you that I'm going to begin my presentation with. So just bear with me for one moment here while I get this up and running. Oh, there we go. What I want to talk to you about today is the psychology of money. And as Tim just mentioned, I'm not going to tell you what to do with your money or where I think the economy or the stock market is going next. What I want to talk about, I think, is more important, but is often overlooked in this industry, which is just what happens in your head when you try to do things with money. And I want to start today with a story of two investors, neither of whom knew each other, but their paths crossed in a very interesting way about 10 years ago. The first investor named Grace Groner. Grace Groner was born on a farm just outside of Chicago in 1910, and she had kind of a hard life. She was orphaned as a child. She never had kids. She never went to college. She lived in a room house for almost her entire life, and she worked secretary for her entire career. She was accounts for those who knew her, a lovely woman, but she had kind of a hard, kind of under the radar life. And Grace Groner died in 2010. She was 100 years old. And when she died, she shocked all of those who knew her, who learned that she left $7 million to charity. And everyone who knew her said, where did Grace, this orphaned secretary who lived by herself, where did she get $7 million? And they dug through her papers. They tried to figure out where it came from. And they realized that there was no secret. There was no lottery winnings. There was no inheritance. Where she got her money was she invested what little she could save from her job as a secretary. She invested it in the stock market, and she left it alone for 80 years. And that was her whole story. That was it. The second investor I want to talk to you about today is a guy named Richard. I'll leave out his last name, but Richard had almost the exact opposite upbringing of Grace Groner. He was a very wealthy family. He went to Harvard. He got his MBA from the University of Chicago. He went to work on Wall Street in the 1980s and truly became one of the most important men in all of global finance. He was a vice chairman of Merrill Lynch. He ran one of their largest divisions. He retired in his early 40s to pursue charitable activities. That's how successful he was in his career on Wall Street. 3 weeks after Grace Gronder died, Richard filed for personal bankruptcy. He told the judge the financial crisis of 2008 had completely wiped him out. He had no income, no assets, so much so that his only ability to buy food for his family was selling the furniture out of his house. And what I think is interesting about these two stories, the juxtaposition of these two stories, is not to tell you be more like Grace and less like Richard. That's not the point. What's interesting about these stories is that there's no other industry where those two stories are even possible. There's no other industry where someone with no education, no background, no training, no experience can massively outperform someone who has the background, the best training, the best education, the best experience. It does not happen in any other field. It's impossible to think of Grace Gronder performing open heart surgery better than a Harvard-trained cardiologist. It would never happen, but that does happen in it. And what that shows is something that's really important in this industry that often goes overlooked, which is that good investing is not necessarily about what you know. It's not about how smart you are or where you went to school, how sophisticated the forecasting models you use are. That's not what good investing is about. Good investing is overwhelmingly about how you behave. It's about your relationship with greed and fear and your ability to take a long-term mindset, how gullible you are, who you trust, who you seek information. And those things, of course, are not analytical exercises. Those are all behavioral, psychological exercises. And the thing about behavior that's really important, behavior is hard to teach, even to very smart people. Since behavior is not analytical, you can't sum it up with charts and formulas that you can memorize. It's not really clean and elegant. It's a soft, mushy topic. So it's easy to discount it, sweep it under the rug in investing, which is tend to be taught as a math-based field, even if we know that the behavioral side of investing is one of the most important aspects of investing. So what do we do about this as investors? To me, since behavior is not analytical, since we can't memorize charts and formulas, the only way to really wrap your head around behavioral finance and the psychology of money is with stories, as Tim mentioned earlier. Stories about real people dealing with risk, dealing with uncertainty that hopefully you can empathize with and try to wrap your head around. Think about the behavioral side of investing, whether it's for you or your clients or your family members, whoever you're working with, to understand the side of investing in a more productive way. So what I want to do today is share with you 4 stories, none of which have anything to do with investing at all, but all of them have a pretty clear takeaway about how we can think about the behavioral side of investing, the behavioral side of risk in a more productive way. So the first story I want to share with you today, let me get this going. Here we go. Is that timing is meaningless, but time is everything. And like I said, the story has nothing to do with investing. The story has to do with ice ages. We have known in the history of this planet, there has been 5 distinct ice ages where the Earth basically from pole to pole turns into a giant ice cube like this. We've known this has been the case for hundreds of years. It's very clear in the geological record. And for most of that period, we have had a rough idea about why this occurs. There's tilts in the Earth's axis that pushes it closer or away or further away from the sun in a way that has a big impact patterns that can turn the Earth into a giant ice cube like this. Until about 100 years ago, most scientists thought that the dynamic that actually got this going, that actually started an ice age, was that we would start having brutally cold and vicious winters from pole to pole that would change weather patterns and would drop a bunch of snow and ice and it would compound on itself until we got this frozen Earth. About years ago, though, scientists who were looking at the geological record realized that the actual dynamic that got an ice age going was the opposite of what we had occurred. How ice ages begin that we now know is not when winters get very vicious. It's actually the opposite. It starts with a moderately cool summer where the previous winter snowmelt does not melt. When the previous winter snow doesn't melt and sticks around all summer, you start winter with a base of snow that didn't melt from the winter. And therefore that winter, more snow accumulates because you started with a strong base. Since more snow accumulates that winter, the next summer you have less summer snow melt. And then this process just goes on and it repeats and it compounds on itself. You start with a moderate summer when a little bit of snow that just doesn't melt sticks around to the next year. And then that process just compounds and it grows from there. Now, it's not intuitive, of course, that you could start with our normal planet Earth, and then you have a moderately cool summer. And the next thing you know, tens of thousands of years later, the Earth is a giant snowball. But that's how ice ages works. It is not intuitive to think that what seems like a tiny, meaningless change in starting variables, like a cool summer where a little bit of snow sticks around, can literally set off a reaction that turns the entire planet into an ice cube. But that is what happens. The power of compounding, of changing a little bit of slight variable at one point and letting it grow over time is never intuitive. Even if you understand, and you're a smart person, you're a finance person, you understand compounding, the power of a change in one small, seemingly meaningless variable is never intuitive. And that is also true in investing. Let me show you what I mean. This is Warren Buffett's net worth during the course of his life by age, going back 14 through today at about age 90. This is net worth by this age. Two things should stick out from this chart, really important. One is that Warren Buffett was fairly wealthy at a young age. By the time he was 20 years old, his net worth was about $100,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's something like $3 million. So by the time he was very young, he was very successful at investing, and he got this early start that got him going. The second thing that should be really clear from this chart is that the vast majority of his net worth came after his 60th birthday. 97% of Warren Buffett's net worth came after his 65th birthday. 9% came after his 50th birthday. So these two things, the fact that Warren Buffett started so early, he was very successful in his teenage years, and he keeps investing through age 90, where the majority of his net worth has come from in his elderly years, is a very important part of his story. Because let's think of a hypothetical world where two small, seemingly meaningless variables were slightly different. Let's assume Warren Buffett didn't start investing at age 14 or age 10. Age 10 actually is when he began. Let's assume he started investing at age 25, like a normal person. And let's assume that he retired at age 65, like a normal person might, rather than investing through age 90 like he has. And let's assume in this hypothetical world that he earned the same average investing returns during this period. He was as successful and as talented as he has been. But let's assume he started at a normal age and retired at a normal age. What would his net worth be in that situation if he started at age 25 and retired at age 65? The answer is not 90 billion as his current net worth is. The answer is actually about 12 million. 99.9% less is what his net worth would be if he started investing at a normal age and retired at a normal age. Look, is Warren Buffett a successful investor, a good investor? Yes, of course. But his secret is that he's been a successful investor for 80 years. And that is very easy to overlook for the throngs of investors who admire him in this industry. Where if you go onto Amazon, there are about 2,000 books that are in some way dedicated to answering the question, how has Warren done what he's done? And they go into grand detail about how Buffett thinks about moats and business and market cycles. And they're great books and make good points. But 99.9% of his net worth can literally be tied to just the amount of time that he has been investing for. I think it's just too simple an explanation for most people to take seriously. It's not intuitive that a tiny change in variables makes all the difference in the world. That's how compounding works. And it's easy particularly for people that have a lot of financial sophistication and knowledge to overlook something that simple. But the best investing technique that you can do for yourself or for other people is always, it's not to improve your investing returns, it's to increase the amount of time you are investing for. So two takeaways from that. I think most investing mistakes come from the question, what will happen next? What is the economy going to do next? What's the stock market going to do next? That is the basis for most regrettable investing decisions that lead to mistakes. Most investing fortunes, most investing successes come from asking the question, how long can I stay investing for? And again, I think the single best thing anyone can do to improve their investing returns and let compounding work and the magic that it is to increase the amount of time that you are investing for. So that's the first story I want to talk to you about today. The second story is that risk is what you don't see. And just like the first story, this has nothing to do with investing. A story about Harry Houdini, the famous magician that did most of his work about 100 years ago. And Houdini, of course, was famous for his escapes. You would tie him up in chains, put him in a straitjacket, throw him in the East River, bury him under sand. He would find his way out. He would unlatch himself and dig his way out. This is what he became famous for. But Harry Houdini actually had another stunt that he did during every show that crowds loved. He wasn't that famous for it, but it was one of the crowd's favorite stunts that he would perform. What he would do at the end of every show is Harry Houdini would invite the largest, most muscular man onto stage, and he would tell that man to punch him in the stomach as hard as he could. Harry Houdini would flex his solar plexus and say, punch me as hard as you can, give it everything you've got, I can stand it. Harry Houdini was an amateur boxer, and his claim to fame was that he could flex his solar plexus in a way that could withstand any man's punches. So he would just let men beat him up on stage and he was fine. One day in 1922, after a show in Canada, Harry Houdini went back to his dressing room and he invited a group of students back to meet him. One of the students was a guy named Robert Whitehead. And Robert Whitehead walked up to Harry Houdini and started hitting him in the stomach as hard as he could. He didn't mean any harm. He thought he was just performing the trick, the stunt that he had just witnessed on stage. But Harry Houdini was not prepared for these punches. He was not flexing his solar plexus. He fell to the ground. He waved Robert Whitehead off and said, "What are you doing? I'm not prepared to be punched." Robert Whitehead felt terrible. He said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Houdini. I thought I was just performing the same trick. I didn't mean to cause you any harm." But Harry Houdini woke up the next morning, doubled over in pain. His appendix had ruptured, almost certainly from Robert Whitehead's punches. And Harry Houdini died that day. That was how Harry Houdini died. And what's so fascinating to me about this is this. Harry Houdini could survive seemingly anything. Put him in a straitjacket and throw him in the East River. He could do that no problem. He did that on a daily basis for his shows. Bury him in sand, under 6 feet of sand, he could dig himself out, no problem, because he was prepared for those things. He knew he had a plan for it. He knew they were coming. He could prepare himself. If he was prepared, he could survive anything. But the one thing that he was not prepared for, getting jabbed in the stomach by a college student, since he was not prepared for it, literally killed him. And I think this is actually true in a lot of fields, that how risky something is depends on whether you're prepared for it. Not how big the event is, not how traumatic it looks, just whether you are prepared for it. And that is also true in the economy. It's also true for investing. The biggest economic risk is what no one is talking about. Because if no one is talking about it, no one is prepared for it. And if no one is prepared for it, its damage will be amplified when it arrives. This has been true, but this has been especially important and relevant this year in 2020, because we spent the last 10 years in the economics profession, in the investing profession, debating, writing about, talking about what was the biggest risk to the economy. And we tend to personify these risks. We say, who is the risk to the economy? So for the last 10 years, we debated, was the biggest risk to the economy this guy? Was it Barack Obama? Was it the stimulus packages, the tax hikes of 2013? Was he the biggest risk to the economy? Was it this guy? Was it Ben Bernanke? Was it all the stimulus that came after the financial crisis, the money printing? Was he the biggest risk? Was it this guy? Was it Donald Trump? Was it trade wars? Was it the policies? Was he the biggest risk to the economy? And we know in hindsight that the answer was no. None of these three guys was the biggest risk to the economy. The biggest risk by far was this guy. It was a virus that no one was talking about, was not in the headlines, was not in any major newspapers until it happened. The biggest risk by far, by an order of magnitude, was the thing that no one was talking about until it happened. And I think if you look historically at the economy and the stock market, this story is always the case, that what people are talking about, the risks that they're talking about, are never actually the biggest risks in hindsight. You know, if you look at the risks that people talk about, it's things like trade wars, next quarter's earnings, budget deficit forecasts, elections. Those are the risks that are in the newspapers that people talk about. And it's not that these things aren't risky. It's that people know about them. They're aware of them. So both financially and psychologically, they're prepared for them when they arrive. But if you look historically at what is actually the biggest risk that moves the needle the most, it's things like COVID-19. Like Lehman Brothers couldn't find a buyer in 2008 that started the financial crisis. September 11th, Pearl Harbor. Those are the biggest risks that actually move the needle. And the common denominator of these is that no one was talking about them until they happened. And I think, you know, this can kind of be disheartening for people to learn that the biggest risk is always what no one's talking about, because it kind of makes you feel vulnerable. It makes you feel like you're kind of a fatalist, just saying, how do I think about risk if the biggest risk is what I'm not thinking about at this given moment? And I think there's two ways to help yourself in this situation to try to get more comfortable with the idea that risk is what you don't see. One is to risk in the economy and investing the same way that California thinks about earthquakes. What I mean by that is having expectations versus forecasts. Because look, if you live in California, you know with 100% certainty that earthquakes will be part of your future. Big, dangerous, risky earthquakes will be part of your future. But you don't know when they're going to occur. You can't forecast when the next earthquake is going to happen. You don't know where it's going to happen. You don't know necessarily how big it's going to be. So rather than trying to forecast the next earthquake, people in California are just prepared for them to occur at any given moment. Firefighters and EMS crews are prepared at any given moment. There's no earthquake pundits. There's no earthquake forecast. You just prepare that at any given moment, it might arrive. And someday it eventually will. I think thinking about economic risk and investing risk the same way is really important. Look, if I were to say, hypothetically, the next recession will occur in Q3 of 2022, I'm just making that up. That's a forecast. And I think that's kind of dangerous. If I were to say instead that historically there have been 2 recessions per decade on average, and we should expect that going forward. I don't know when they're going to occur. I don't know what's going to trigger them, but my asset allocation and my psychology is prepared for at least 2 recessions per decade as my baseline assumption. I think that's a much healthier way to think about risk. The other thing to think about here is the idea of getting rich versus staying rich, 2 very different skills that need to be nurtured on their own. Getting rich requires being an optimist, swinging for the fences, taking a risk. That's what you need to get rich. Staying rich is almost the opposite. Staying rich requires a little bit of paranoia that you don't know what's going to happen next, that the future is going to be risky, that there's going to be setbacks and disappointments, recessions, bear markets, pandemics that you need to be prepared for with cash and of debt. These are conflicting skills, but I think everyone needs both of them and needs to be able to nurture them separately to do well at investing over time. So that's the second story to tell you today. The third story is that you can be wrong half the time and still do great. And this story, again, has nothing to do with investing. This is a story about baby brain development. For those of you who have kids, you will know that the amount of growth that takes place in a newborn baby's brain is extraordinary. The average newborn child is born with about 100 billion brain neurons, and each one of those is about 3,000 synaptic connections, or these connections to other neurons that forms this web of intelligence. And maybe when the baby is born, that web looks something like this. By the time the average child is 6 months old, the number of synaptic connections has increased from 3,000 to 6,000. So a lot of growth in the first 6 months of life that increases the density of this web of knowledge inside of your head. By age 2, that's increased from 6,000 to 12,000 synaptic connections. And then after 2 years, something very interesting happens, which is that the number of synaptic connections in your brain does not just plateau, it starts to decline. And it declines fairly rapidly. By the time the average child is age 4, they've already lost about 1/5 of the synaptic connection density that they had when they were 2 years old. By the time the average child is 6 years old, they've lost about 1/3 of what they had when they were 2 years old. And now this continues all throughout childhood, into adolescence, into early adulthood. By the time the average person is 25 years old, they've lost half of the synaptic connection density that they had when they were 2 years old. Why does this occur? Well, it turns out that a lot of the learning that takes place in the early years of your life is learning that is redundant, it is unnecessary, it's wired inefficiently in your brain. A lot of it is just completely miswired. There is some evidence that particularly in the first few minutes of a newborn's child life, that some babies can hear colors and smell sounds because the part of your brain that processes that information is totally miswired. So you go through a lot of your early years getting rid of these inefficient, redundant, and unnecessary synaptic connections in your brain. But what's important about this is that even though what's going on inside of your head is a loss and destruction, you're still getting smarter. A 4-year-old is much smarter than a 2-year-old. And a 20-year-old is much smarter than a 4-year-old, most of the time, on average. We all know exceptions. But look, this idea that what's going on inside your head is chaos and loss and destruction, even though you're improving and getting much smarter, is really important, but it's not intuitive. You can imagine if you are a parent who could look inside your child's brain every morning and see that they had fewer synaptic connections than the day before. You would panic. You would say, this can't be right. This can't be how cognitive development is supposed to happen. Something must be wrong. I need to make an intervention. I need to see a doctor, even if that is actually the normal path of growth over time. So the idea that something can be failing and declining amid progress is not very intuitive, but we see it in a lot of fields. And one of the fields we see it very often in is in investing. Let me show you what I mean. This is the Russell 3000 index going back to 1980. So there's a lot of volatility in here, but this is really the picture of success for a large nation's stock market. This is average annual returns of about 11% per year. If we can repeat this over the next 40 years, this is about as good as anyone can hope for. But if you look at what went on inside of the index period, how these 3,000 companies performed during this period, the individual companies inside the index, you get a totally different view. You will see that the median stock in the index underperformed the average 54 percentage points. 40% of the companies in this index lost money over this 40-year period. The vast majority of those are companies that went out of business. They didn't merge or get bought out by another company. They went bankrupt. They went out of business. 40% of the components in this large index. Virtually all of the returns come from 7% of companies that account for virtually all of the returns over time. So here again, you start with the picture of success, an index that's done very well over time. But when you look at what went on inside of the index, it's a constant chain of chaos and loss and destruction. And as investors, we are constantly being bombarded of news of companies missing earnings targets, going out of business, companies performing very poorly. And it is tempting, it is intuitive to say, this can't be right, this is wrong, I need to make an intervention, even if that is the normal path of diversified growth over a long period of time. This also impacts how we think about something like volatility as investors. This is the S&P 500 going back to its inception in 1957. And this is like the picture of success. This is as good as it gets for a large nation stock market. If we can do this again over the next 60 years, it's as good as anyone can hope for. But this I want to show you, that is when the market was down 5% from its previous all-time high. That's when it's down 10% from its previous all-time. And that's when it's down 20% or more from the previous all-time high. So you start with as good as it gets, as good as anyone can hope for. But then you look at the nuance of what happened during this period, and it's a constant chain of loss and destruction. And what's important about this is that at every one of these bars on this chart, you have smart investors all over the world who wake up and say, this can't be right. This can't be how growth is supposed to work. Something feels broken, something feels wrong, so I need to make an intervention. And so they end up selling, thinking they're doing something good for themselves, when actually what they're doing is pulling themselves away from the long-term investing strategy that's likely to work over time. My favorite investing quote is actually not an investing quote. It comes from Dwight Eisenhower, president in general, who was once asked, I'm going to skip ahead here, was once asked the definition of a military genius. And Dwight Eisenhower said, a military genius is the man who can do the average thing when everyone else around him is losing his mind. I think investing is the exact same. That good investing is not necessarily about making great decisions. Good investing is about consistently not making mistakes and consistently not screwing up and not reacting to the chaos and loss and destruction in the short term that is likely to, if we are reacting to it, is likely to pull us away from a long-term strategy that will earn the highest returns. Charlie Munger, the billionaire investor, has a great quote that I think summarizes this when he says, the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. And now the last story I want to talk to you about today is that there are no points awarded for difficulty. And true to my style here, the story has nothing to do with investing as well. This is a story about the war on cancer. The war on cancer really picked up in earnest in the United States in the early 1970s. And if you go back to this period in the early 1970s, there was a big burst of scientific optimism. We had just landed on the moon. We had made huge strides in wiping out polio in the United States. There's just a general sense that if scientists put their heads together, they can solve any scientific problem, no matter how hairy and big it looks. So in the early 1970s, we came together and said, it's time to cure cancer, to wipe out cancer like we had just wiped out polio in the United States. The National Cancer Act was signed in 1972, which began a big surge of scientific funding for cancer treatments and cancer research. And this is what has happened next. These are the 5-year age-adjusted cancer survival rates for various cancers. And you can see that most of them are up, and they're up by a lot. So the war on cancer has been very successful at saving and extending tens of millions of lives. But a few years ago, the director of the National Cancer Institute, his name is Harold Varmus, gave a speech at the annual meeting of the National Cancer Institute. And he said, look, despite this progress that the cancer community should be so thrilled about and proud of, we need to come to terms with an inconvenient truth, which is that we have not been able to wipe out cancer and cure cancer like we once thought possible. Like we once imagined that we were going to do when we started the war on cancer. We have not been able to do that. And we might not ever be able to cure cancer like we once thought possible. It's turned out to be a much more difficult and complex illness than we ever imagined. And Harold Varmus said, look, if you accept that truth, then what the cancer community needs to do is to open up a new front in the war on cancer, which is prevention. Because we know that in the United States, roughly half of all cancers can be directly tied to lifestyle, particularly diet, exercise, and smoking. So he said, look, if you want these numbers to go up even more and make a bigger impact on the war on cancer, we need to make prevention the number one front in the war on cancer. And what has happened since is very interesting over the last 10 years, which is that despite knowing how important cancer prevention is to the war on cancer, it's very difficult to get a lot of doctors interested in cancer prevention relative to their interest in cancer treatments. Very difficult to raise money for cancer prevention relative to what you can raise for cancer treatments. It's very difficult to get politicians and regulators interested in cancer prevention relative to their interest in cancer treatments. Now, a few years ago, one of the top cancer researchers in the world, his name was Robert Weinberg from MIT, was giving a speech, and he made a comment about why this is, about why cancer prevention is so difficult to take seriously, even if we know it's so important in this war on cancer. And what Robert Weinberg said was this, quote, "If you don't get cancer, you are not going to die from it. That is a simple truth that we overlook because it is intellectually not very stimulating." He went on to say, quote, "Getting someone to quit smoking is a behavioral exercise. It has nothing to do with cells and molecules. So people like me are essentially uninterested in it, in spite of the fact that getting someone to quit smoking will have vastly greater impact on cancer mortality than anything I can hope to achieve in my own lifetime." So this is interesting, right? You have one of the top cancer researchers in the world, and he's saying, I can make a bigger difference doing something else, but it's not exciting for him. It's not intellectually stimulating for him. And of course, we don't want people like Robert Weinberg becoming smoking cessation counselors. He is a molecular biologist. He adds a lot of value in his own way. But there's this irony in the war on cancer, which is that things that are very simple, very basic, very boring, but knowingly effective are discounted, and they're not taken as seriously as other things that are complex and exciting, but knowingly less effective. And I think that fundamental irony also exists in investing. We know how to do well in the stock market over a long period of time. It's not very difficult. All you need to do is spend less money than you make, save the difference, buy a diverse low-cost portfolio, and be patient. That's effectively 90% of what you need to know to do well at investing over a long period of time. But do you think this is how investing is taught in schools at the academic level? I still have a finance textbook left over from college, and there is a chapter in there called the Assessment of Confidence Limits of Selected Values of Complex Valued Models. And that formula is in there. No idea what it means. But look, the left side of this chart is like the diet and exercise side of investing. It's so boring, it's so basic, but it works. It makes a difference. This is what moves the needle. The right side of this chart is like the stem cell therapy side of investing. It's not that it's bad. A lot of it is great. We should be thankful that we have it. But we know it's less effective than the simple stuff that makes a difference. And again, as I said earlier, something like this is most relevant to a group like this that does have a lot of financial sophistication, a lot of intelligence and education. That tends to be the group that is most likely to ignore the simple stuff that works and makes a difference in favor of the complicated stuff that it's not that it's bad, but it's less important than the simple stuff that we tend to sweep under the rug. Let me show you what I mean. One example of this. This is Warren Buffett's office in Omaha, Nebraska. He's office at this desk in this chair for about 60 years. So this is the office where he became the world's greatest investor. And I just want you to notice how simple and basic it is. There's no computer, there's no TV, there's no ticker tapes, there's no analyst shouting in his ears. It's just a desk and some where he can read about companies and buy the good ones that he wants. Simple and basic as it possibly can get. This I want to show you. This is the prop trading desk at Lehman Brothers right before they went bankrupt in 2008. You see this guy has 8 monitors in front of him. He knows what he's looking at, but the poor guy next to him only has 4 monitors, so he's probably completely oblivious in the world. But look, if you are a young person leaving college and you're a smart person, you're looking for an exciting career in finance, what looks more intellectually stimulating to you, this or this? Or if you are a hedge fund manager and you're trying to show your clients that you are smart and you're earning your fee, do you want your clients to see this office or this office? It's obvious where the intellectual attention goes to in this industry. But the irony, of course, is that these people went bankrupt, and this is the world's greatest investor by far. And speaking of someone like Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, there was a 20-year period when the average private equity fund returned about 14% per year, and Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, returned about 19% per year. So this outperformance of about 5 annual percentage points over what I think is its most relevant benchmark is what has made Warren Buffett, in annual percentage terms, the greatest investor of all time. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there are 1,000 books on Amazon that try to explain how this happened. Where did this outperformance come from? How did he do it? And they go into grand detail about market cycles and business models, how Buffett thinks about valuation and so on. But here's a simple point that I want you to keep in mind. The average private equity fund is charging 2 and 20 as fees. It's a simple kind of industry standard fee structure, 2% of assets, 20% of profits. Virtually every private equity fund will do this. That's the fee structure. Berkshire Hathaway charges no fees whatsoever. There's no fees. Warren Buffett's total compensation is $100,000 per year. It's been like that forever. There's no other fees associated with it. Just that one fact alone, just the fact that the average private equity fund is charging 2 and 20, while Berkshire charges nothing, just that fact alone accounts for 4 percentage points of the outperformance. How many of those 2,000 books trying to obtain Buffett's outperformance do you think mention this? I've never seen it mentioned anywhere once. And I think the reason it's not mentioned is because the idea that a lot of Buffett's outperformance can be explained by something like fees is too simple for people to take seriously. People don't want to believe that something so extraordinary can take place and be caused by something so incredibly simple. But Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's longtime business partner, was once asked by a journalist in kind of a way. The journalist said, if Berkshire Hathaway's strategy is simple, why haven't more people been able to copy it? Why haven't more people emulated it? And Munger said, quote, more investors don't copy our model because our model is too simple. Most people believe you cannot be an expert if it is too simple. He went on to say, quote, how did Berkshire's record happen? If you were an observer, you would see that Warren did most of it by sitting on his ass and just as simple and as basic as it can possibly get. One other example of this that I think is so extraordinary is a guy named Harry Markowitz, who won the Nobel Prize in the early 1990s for his work on the capital asset pricing model, which is a very mathematically complex set of formulas that will tell you exactly how much of your assets should be in stocks or bonds based on how much risk you want to take. Mathematically complex, he won the Nobel Prize for this. A few years ago, someone asked Markowitz how he invests his own money. And he said, quote, I visualize if the stock market went way up and I wasn't in it, or if it went down and I was completely in it. So I split my contributions 50-50 between stocks and bonds. So this is the guy who won the Nobel Prize for these very complicated set of formulas, and he doesn't even use them in investing. And I think what that shows is that what works in investing is really simple rules of thumb based off of your own psychology. Complicated stuff, it's not that it's bad, but its main purpose is to exist because it is stimulating to very smart academics. And so I think one takeaway from this is that I think the best investing advice that you can take for yourself or to give to someone else is to take a simple idea and take it seriously. We need to be reminded that the goal of investing is not to minimize boredom. It is to maximize returns. And most importantly, that no investment recommendation is worth the paper it is written on if you cannot stick with it or if you are likely to abandon it at a time of confusion. Stick around as an investor and have endurance for 10 or 20 or 30 years. And of course, we all do to the extent that we can. You need to understand why you are investing and what you're investing in the simple terms possible. And so if there is a common denominator of these stories today, it's that when people tend to think about risk in investing, I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share here one moment. It's that when people tend to think about risk in investing, they tend to think about what is going to happen to them. What is the stock market going to do to me? What is the economy going to do next? And I tend to think a better definition of risk is just what we do to ourselves. It's our own biases, our own misconceptions, to our own histories. And that can kind of be disheartening for people to hear that you are your own worst enemy. But I actually think the most optimistic as an investor, because you and I have no control over what the market is going to do next or what the economy is going to do next. The only thing that we can control as investors is our own behaviors, our own emotions. And when you realize that the most is the only thing that we control, the only lever that we have to pull, that's actually a pretty optimistic realization. So that's the end of my prepared for today. Thank you for listening, but I think we're going to have some time for some Q&A now. And I'll be happy to take your questions, talk about what has happened in this crazy and uncertain and unpredictable year. So thank you.
Yeah, Morgan, thank you. It's always great. You generally hear a big applause right now, but unfortunately in the world of Zoom and COVID, it's just me thanking you for that great prepared remarks. So, one of the things I find fascinating is you explain these counterintuitive concepts and they're idiosyncratic, and a bit of your whole life is a little bit idiosyncratic. Would you just take us through a little bit of, and I don't want this to be derogatory, so just to take us through the ski bum phase. Most people would think, hey, you come from Harvard, you were a 4.0 student, you were like I'm a financial nerd and this is what I do. But that's not who you really are. So take us through your early age, because I found that very fascinating, because in the age of adolescent adults, I watched them doing things totally different than the structure I was told to follow growing up. I'd love to have our audience hear that.
Yeah, so I have kind of a unique background. I mean, we all have unique backgrounds, but mine was I grew up as a competitive ski racer in Lake Tahoe, California, and as part of that, it was kind of important given that ski racing background that I could ski a week. So in that sense, myself and all my peers who I was growing up doing this with kind of viewed high school as a nuisance. And so most of us effectively bypassed high school. We did an independent study program where we did no academics, basically. We did virtually nothing. When I was 16, they gave me a piece of paper that said diploma on it. I did virtually nothing for it. So pretty much had no high school education at all. And I started college when I was 20, and I had to start at the most basic bare bones level because I effectively had an 8th grade education at that point. So it was really difficult for me to get back into it. I just had to start at the most remedial courses possible and kind of work into it. And I'd always known that I was really interested in investing. Even before I started college, it was always just fascinating. I didn't know anything about it, but I was just fascinated to watch it and see, kind of try to what was going on. You had no idea what was going on. And so all throughout college, I thought I was going to go into investment banking or private equity. But as I got some internships in those fields, I realized that they were not for me. Like hardcore Wall Street finance, just the culture of it was not for me. It's a very just like macho hazing culture that was really off-putting for me. So I needed to do something else. And I had a friend who was a writer for the Motley Fool at the time. And he said, Morgan, you're interested in investing. Why don't you apply to become a Motley Fool writer? And I had no writing background or even interest at that point, but I thought I'll give this a whirl, see what happens. And I ended up falling in love with the process of writing and writing about investing, writing about the economy. So that was 2008. So kind of the teeth of the financial crisis, which was an interesting time to start thinking about the behavioral side of investing, because I realized during that period that the answers for why the financial crisis happened, why did people make the decisions that they did, why did they behave the way that they did, could not be found in any finance textbook or economics textbook. But you find subtle clues to what happened in a psychology textbook and a sociology textbook and a history, political science textbook. So I just started viewing investing as a much more holistic field where investing is not really the study of finance. Investing is a study of how people make decisions with their money. So since it's this broad behavioral field, there was all these other things that you could learn from other fields like psychology and sociology and history and military history and whatnot that taught you something vital about investing. So that was kind of the path that I went down, the untraditional path that got me here.
That's Morgan. Let's there's a couple other questions here. What has been the most interesting story? I mean, you gave us 4 stories of Buffett, Houdini, but what's the most unique kind of rags to riches to rags story? You told us about the Merrill Lynch that you've come across in your research that really makes that point about, just not being so overthinking this and staying the course.
There's a story that I tell in the book about a famous investor named Jesse Livermore, who was a well-known investor. He did most of his investing in the early 20th century. And he was and probably is the greatest investor of all time in terms of his ability to make money, make a fortune. He was short the market in 1929. He became, by some accounts, the richest man in the world in 1929 because he was short the market right before the crash. He was, adjusted for inflation, a multi-billionaire. And he did it several times. He was a successful investor for a lot of his life. But what's so interesting to me about Jesse Livermore that is less well known than his success is that he was probably the greatest person at getting rich in the entire world, but he had absolutely no skill whatsoever at staying rich. So I think at 4 separate times in Jesse Livermore's life, he went from the equivalent of a billionaire to bankrupt 4 times in his life. And the last time he made the biggest fortune of his life, again in 1929, when he was short the market. He was the richest man in the world, but then he just kept taking ever larger bets, more risk, bigger bets, bolder bets. And he eventually broke again. And this part is well known. He eventually committed suicide. So Jesse Livermore's story is so fascinating to me because he was the best at getting rich, but he could not stay rich. He had no skill whatsoever to stay rich over time. And he actually wrote a lot about this, that it was a weird thing about him, that he was so good at reading the markets, but he kept going bankrupt. So to me, it's kind of the takeaway from that is, again, I mentioned this earlier, getting rich and staying rich are two very different skills. And they can often seem like conflicting skills. And I've often thought that most investors can do well by saving like a pessimist and investing like an optimist. You need to save money and have an avoidance of debt like a pessimist, with this idea that the world is risky and the short term is going to be filled with bear markets and recessions and pandemics, and it's going to keep happening. The world is a dangerous place. But you need to invest like an optimist. Invest like a long-term optimist, with the idea that people are going to solve problems and companies are going to become profitable and it's going to accrue to you. And those seem conflicting, but you need both of them at the same time. You need to figure out how those two skills can coexist, of optimism and pessimism at the same. And someone like Jesse Livermore is the extreme example of someone who did not have it. He had all of his skills was in and none of it was in staying rich, and it ended up with the most tragic way possible. So his story is one of the most interesting financial stories.
Interesting. Let's put the survey up, and then we'll jump into a couple more questions. So Michelle, let's see if we can pull that up. Okay. Has 2020 shifted your thinking about risk as an investor? Let's do that. And has 2020 been more impactful on your investment thinking than 2008? And you can scroll through. I'd love to get your answers. How often do you think a 10% market decline occurs historically? Let's have you answer those three polls, and I'm going to have Morgan answer a couple questions. First question is really, what advice would you give folks, Morgan, that are just starting out investing later in life and hoping to make up as much time as possible for that lost time?
Well, look, I think, there's two sets of advice here. One is that it's never too late. Just as long as you have a couple of years in front of you, 5 years in front of you, you can, then the odds of doing market are fall into your favor. Kind of advice that I think is not necessarily what people always want to hear, but I think is really important. It's just to embrace the reality of your situation with both hands. And I've seen a lot of people in a situation where they say, I don't have 20 years for my money to compound. I only have 3. I need to make my market returns in the next 3 years or the next 2 years. And I think it's always important to understand that the market does not care how much time you have. The market doesn't care how old you are. The market will do what it's going to do. And it's important for people to embrace the reality that, historically in the stock market, if you have less than 5 years in front of you, then the odds of doing well, it's not that you can't do well in the market. It's that you are relying on a degree of luck to fuel your success than you would of someone who has a longer time horizon. So I think be realistically optimistic situation, optimistic that hey, it's not too late. You can still do this, but let's embrace the fact that you don't have 40 years in front of you, and embrace that with both hands and be realistic about the risk, the amount of risk that you might be willing to take in your situation.
Yeah. And then there's always this debate. And again, we have some folks that are participants of the tens of thousands of plan participants we service in our 401k practice. One of them's asking, hey, is renting better than owning? And how do you think about that and that as an investment versus a lifestyle choice?
I think it's a really fascinating topic that I love. It's one of my favorite topics, to kind of rent versus own. Robert Shiller of Yale University won the Nobel Prize actually for some data that he put together of inflation-adjusted U.S. home prices going back to, I think, the late 1800s. This data of home prices adjusted for inflation. And for virtually the entire period from the late 1800s through about the 1990s, adjusted for inflation, U.S. home prices were flat as a pancake, adjusted for inflation. They went nowhere. You made no money. And Robert Shiller's point was, of course, that's the case. A house is just it's just a pile of bricks and lumber. The lumber, the bricks are going to crack. Well, why should it go up in value? That was the case for the huge majority of history. It wasn't until about the last 20 years that U.S. home prices started doing this. And of course, they crashed in 2007, 2008, but then they've rebounded by and large nationwide. So there's a big part of me that still wants to anchor on the majority of U.S. history, that that owning a house, great thing. We own our house, but I view it as a safe place to live. I don't view it as an investment. I view it as an asset, but I don't view it as an investment over time. I don't plan that it's going to increase at some incredible value over time and it's going to, pay for my retirement and whatnot. I think historically, that's a pretty dangerous piece of advice. Of course, there is so much value in mobility. I think particularly in this day and age, if you can get up and go, particularly early on in your career, where you're almost like the odds that you're going to need to move for a job change at some point in your 20s are so high, then that mobility pays for itself and then some. So I think just shifting your expectations away from, is a house a good investment? But it can be a good asset. It can be a good store of value over time, but you shouldn't really assume that's renting out a house where you are renting it and someone's paying you rent. That's a different story, because then you have a cash flow coming out of it that look much more like a normal investment. But for most people, for us, I love owning my house. It feels great. It's a great place to live. I have it as an asset on my balance sheet, but I don't expect to make any profit in real terms adjusted for inflation over time.
Yeah, let's let's go ahead and share these poll results. So has 2020 shifted the way you've thought about risk? Fortunately, most people, not really. I mean, that's good to hear. Has 2020 been more impactful for investment thinking than 2008? I mean, this is a global pandemic. I mean, this is a big deal. And it seems like maybe folks have anchored themselves to that peak end bias from 2008. Like that was the worst event. And I got to say, that felt horrific from my view, because it felt like it was more torturous. It lasted longer. It was like being waterboarded day after day for months with 700-point down days. So I kind of think that 2008 personally was more like viscerally painful from a risk standpoint.
Yeah.
And then Morgan, how often do you think a 10% market decline occurs historically? Do you want to give the answer, Morgan?
The answer is D, about once per year historic. It's actually a little bit less. If you look, it's on average about every 11 months that we've had a 10% decline. Which, look, there's 2 points from the survey to bring up on this last point about the frequency of declines. I think one of the most pieces of information that investors can have is a history of market volatility. Because again, once you realize that over the last 100 years, the market has declined at least 10% every 11 months, then the next time it happens, it might be a little palatable. And you might say, look, this isn't fun. I don't enjoy this, but this is normal. This is a totally normal thing for the market to do. And even if you look at a 30% decline, historically, that's something that happens once or twice per decade. So if you plan on investing for the next 20 years, you should expect the market to lose 30% of its value or more 3 or 4 times. And once you're more familiar with those, I think it makes dealing with volatility, dealing with bear markets, just a little bit easier and a little bit more. You're viewing it as, this isn't fun, but this is what happens. It's okay. I'm going to grin and bear it and stick it through. The other point about 2020 versus 2008 that I think is really important for generational thoughts about how the world works is that it was easy in 2008 to say, this is bad, but this is a once in a century crisis, a once in a century recession. Isn't going to happen again probably in my lifetime. This is bad, but this is a fluke event. Now that in many ways a worse recession occurred this year for tens of millions of people, I think you're going to have much more people and whole generations say, this is how the world works. 2008 was not a once in a century event. Maybe since this happened again, this is just how the world works. Every 10 years, the world that I know is to pieces. I think it's almost analogous to the generation that went through the Great Depression. And then as soon as that was done, was thrust into World War II. I think that generation went through the rest of their life. And there's research on this showing that generation went through the rest of their life, assuming that every 10 years, the world falls apart. And it had a big impact on how they think about risk, how they take on business risk, how their willingness to go into debt, that stuck with them. So I think the idea that wounds heal, like just like we recovered from September 11th, we'll recover from this, recover from 2008, but scars last. And I think the fact that we had another recession of equal size 10 after 2008, 12 years after 2008, will stick with people in a big way for the rest of their life.
Yeah. And final question, Morgan. And again, this is for the folks that we just really try to encourage to bring young investors and of all kinds onto this call. What's the percentage? What's the rule of thumb, the heuristic for savings versus spending? And I know I'm as guilty as anybody of overspending at times, but what's your sense on that? And maybe I'll give my answer.
There's a one size fits answer, but it's based on your income, your age, and just your preferences in life. My wife and I have a very high savings rate. It's very high, but that's because what's really important to us is independence. That's what we want out of finances. Well, I don't necessarily care about having a fancy car or whatnot. That's not what I want out of finances. Is just the ability to do whatever I want, whenever I want to. I want independence. So for us, that high savings rate is important. But there are other people for whom that's not a good answer. Other people want the fancy car, and that's fine. I'm not saying that's wrong. Everyone's a little bit different. I think knowing where you sit on that, do you want, like, from your money, do you want nice stuff or do you want independence? That is the variable that should set your savings rate. And if you are really introspective and you know yourself and you say, no, I want nice stuff, I want the fancy car, the fancy watch, the big house, then spend some money. I think that's great. If you are on the other end of the spectrum as we are, and you say, I just want independence, I'm going to have a very high savings rate, but that's okay. I'm not robbing myself of any pleasure from going out and spending the money, because what I want is the money that's not spent. I want the wealth that's going to give me the independence. So I think that's not the answer that people want to hear, because I didn't give you a figure, but I think understanding just where you sit on that spectrum is the right answer for everyone.
And to that point, Morgan, how do you think this pandemic speaks to precautionary savings? As you know, savings rates have really skyrocketed since the pandemic started. People tucked away money. I mean, we got, I don't know, off the top of my head, 30% savings rates at the peak. We're now down to 12, 13, and normally we're drifting around between 0 and 7%. China, of course, maintains the mid-40s savings rates. Do you think that Americans, as perennial consumers, will create or keep more precautionary savings based on a behavioral basis?
I think that's likely to be the case. Look, there's some, if you think about the closest analog to what we're going through, it's the 1918 flu pandemic. And there's actually not evidence that in terms of economic behavior, that had much of an impact on Americans. I mean, the 1920s was the roaring 20s. This is the era of the speakeasy and the jazz bar. People were going out and spending money. That was the huge consumer boom around radios and cars for new technology. So that's one end of it. And there's also evidence like the Great Depression and whatnot that did stick with people. So I definitely think, particularly I think the generation that's probably most susceptible to this are the older millennials, because that is a group that started their career, started their young adult life in the teeth of the 2008 recession. And then they had a very tepid recovery. And then boom, in 2020, they got shoved right back into this terrible job market, terrible economy. So I think when all you have ever known is crash and then tepid recovery and then crash again, it can leave a whole generation with this idea that this is just how the world works. I've never known anything else. This is how the world works. So I think that generation will be scarred, and their willingness to go into debt, and therefore their propensity to save money, will be higher than it was for other generations, for Gen X and baby boomers. I tend to think that Gen X and baby boomers, who have seen other parts of the world, they experienced the 1990s and the early 2000s and the prosperity from that, will have a harder time being scarred from this. They kind of already have their economic model in their head. It's the younger generation that's still trying to figure out how this works that I think will be most financially scarred and will have a higher savings rate coming out of this.
Yeah. As we wrap up, Morgan, I just want to give you a compliment. I get to work with my son, but we also used your book as a way to have dialogue. So we listened to 3 or 4 chapters a week. We'd get on the call and talk about it. I'd encourage all my clients that have got these adolescent, mid-20s kids that are stuck in this pandemic and kind of searching for a path forward, to go online, to get on Amazon, buy The Psychology of Money, or even get it downloaded on Audible and use it as an engagement tool for your kids, because they're probably looking for ways to engage with you and you with them. Morgan, it's always great to have such insightful thought leaders like yourself. We're grateful you'd make your time available to us. Thank all of you out there for logging in, dialing in, spending an hour with us. We certainly want to make sure that we wish you all the health and happiness and staying safe in this pandemic. We hope it's over soon, and we think that this will end up creating more like you, Morgan. We think there'll be a little higher precautionary savings, and might be interesting to see how it plays out in the economy. Morgan, thanks again. Be well, and thanks for the time.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks everyone for coming on today. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.